God's big story of the Bible. And tonight we're going to be going into lesson number 6 of our study. And but for the benefit of those who maybe have been joining me for the first time, I just want to do a real quick review. And it won't be in detail, but it'll be just kind of brief. And if you're joining us for the first time, I highly recommend that you go back and take a look at our previous studies 1 through 5 to kind of get caught up to where we are today. But just by way of quick review, I want to just talk about what we're dealing with. We're talking about and what we're unpacking, like again, what I said, God's big story, or unlocking God's big story of the Bible. Now, what exactly do we mean when we talk about God's big story of the Bible? And essentially, in a nutshell, what we're referring to is the idea that the Bible is so much more than the all of the isolated inspirational stories that we've learned, in most of our lives, especially going all the way back to our Sunday school days. In other words, you can kind of look at the Bible like a puzzle. And we talked about this in our first episode. And in order to put a puzzle together, you have to dump the puzzle pieces out on the table, but in order to assemble the pieces in their proper order, or in order to formulate the entire picture, you have to be able to first see the big picture on the box in order to know where the little smaller pieces fit into the bigger picture. And the Bible is just like that. For example, we all know about David and Goliath, and Jonah and the whale, Noah and the ark, which we talked about last week, David and Goliath, so on and so forth. All these famous inspirational stories, Joseph in his coat of many colors, Paul on the Damascus road, so on and so forth. I mean, the list of stories and incidents are endless. However, what we didn't learn in Sunday school, or most of us didn't, is, I will go out on a limb to say, is that we didn't understand how all these isolated pieces fit into God's big picture. And the truth of the matter is that the Bible, in which we're trying to what we're trying to prove in this series of lessons, that the Bible is more than those inspirational stories. However, the Bible is one big story, one book that tells one big story, and that big story is God's plan for humanity's redemption and restoration after the fall. In other words, it's like if you're reading a novel, and you're doing a book report on that novel, you have to understand that, first of all, that you have a beginning and you have a conclusion or a climax, and in between you have the body of the book, or the novel, and which tells us how we got from the beginning, how we got to the climax. And the Bible is very similar. It's one story, even though it has, and you can kind of look at it as having 66 chapters. And then also you can look at it as being divided. You have Act 1, which is the Old Testament, and Act 2, which is the New Testament, but it's all a continuous narrative. And we talked about earlier about how the Bible is a progressive revelation, meaning that God will progressively reveal new aspects of his plan over time, and in order up until the time when we get to the ultimate climax, which of course is in the book of Revelation, where John said, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth." And so that's what we mean. That's what we're talking about when we refer to God's big story of the Bible. So now let's just kind of like go into our study here. Let me just get this up. And so now let's just let me just go back here for a minute, because I may have made an error here. Just give me a moment. Just give me a moment here, because I think I might have clicked something incorrectly. Okay. A little technical difficulty going on here. All right, there we go. There we go. All right, now. Okay, now. All right, back on track. All right, now, so again, so this is what we're talking about. God's big story of the Bible. That's kind of like the summary. And so let's just go and again do a quick review. We are coming. Remember, we mentioned that we're looking at the Word of God in like two segments. We're looking at the big picture in we're calling it Act 1 and Act 2. Act 1 is the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, we're doing a survey. We're doing an overview, a big picture overview of the Old Testament. And what we're doing is that we're examining this big picture by looking at the 11 Old Testament foundational books. Now, what stands out or what's significant about the 11 books that we're going to point out here in just a moment? Well, as you know, when you examine or when you study the canon that we currently have in our Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament, although they're inspired by the Holy Ghost, they're not listed or canonized in their proper historical order. In other words, the proper chronological order in which the events took place, or which the books or the events of the books actually took place. But there are 11 books that we call foundational books that give us the chronological and historical storyline of the Old Testament, and all the other 28 books in one way or another supplement these 11 foundational books. And that's just kind of a basic review. And again, I want to encourage you, if you just following for the first time, to go back and examine and take a look at our previous studies where we went into that in a little bit more detail. But again, let's just take a look at what these 11 foundational books are. And during the course of this study, I'm calling it Act 1, the big picture of the Old Testament. And during the course of that, we're not going to be examining like every book of the Old Testament or in depth, but we're going to track through these 11 foundational books, and then we're going to plug in from time to time. We'll take a pause, we'll stick a pin there, and then we'll go in it and we'll pull out, for example, when we get to 2 Samuel, which was written, which is where majority of the Psalms are written, because the 2 Samuel tells us the reign of King David. So we'll take a pause and we'll maybe take a quick look at the Psalm. We won't be able to unpack the Psalms all the way through verse by verse, but we'll just do a quick overview on the Psalms, and then we'll then proceed back down the road of the 11 foundational books. Now, these 11 foundational books are Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Now, I really, really encourage everybody who's listening to this to be able to just in your mind, just be able to list these 11 foundational books and just be able to quote them off, at the drop of a hat. It's very important. If you really want to have a much more scholarly understanding of the Old Testament, be able to know these 11 foundational books, be able to quote them, and just kind of get a basic understanding. And it's going to expand your understanding of the Old Testament in ways that you can't even probably imagine right now. I've literally had in the past, and this is not any credit to me, because I didn't discover this system. I learned it just like you guys are learning it right now. But I have taught this in a number of times in the past, and I've had seminary students who spent thousands of dollars going to seminary, and they've come back, and I've been told this multiple times, if truth be told, that they've learned the Old Testament more by following this system in one session than they learned in their entire time in seminary. And that's something that I've been told 3 or 4 times by individuals who graduated from seminary. So that being said, and again, no reflection on me, but it just shows you the impact of the system that we're trying to share. Now, these 11 foundational books, like I've said, give us the historical and chronological big picture storyline of the Old Testament. And note that term, the big picture, is found in these 11 foundational books. Now, if you can look at this chart here that I have up on the screen, and you can see going horizontal, these 11 foundational books, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And you can look on the sides here, and you can see all the corresponding books that are tied into these or supplement or complement in one way or another, or occurred during the time frame of one of these 11 foundational books. Just to kind of give you an example, when you take a look at the writing prophets, notice what I said, the writing prophets, the books of Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Isaiah, Micah, and Joel occurred in First Kings, or those events happened in First Kings. And you can see, just for an example, and of course you can look over here and see the captivity period is during that period where the books of Daniel and Ezekiel were written, and so forth. And so you can see again, as we talked about, the book of Psalms was written during the time and the reign of David, and so forth. So you can see, and again, and we mentioned this earlier, the book of Judges, chapter 1, I'm sorry, the book of Ruth, rather, chapter 1 and verse 1, right off the bat tells us, during the time that the judges ruled. That tells us right off the bat that the events that are about to be described in the book of Ruth, with Ruth and Boaz and the kinsman redeemer, and that entire narrative, that sequence of events occurred during some time during the period of the judges. And so again, that would make Ruth a supplemental book to the book of Judges. So that's just kind of a big picture overview of the approach that we're taking in this study. Now, we started with we've been diving into and which the number one, or the first foundational book. In fact, it's going to be the book that I'm probably going to spend the most time in before we go and proceed to the next foundational books. But we're going to probably spend the majority of our time in terms of the number of weeks spent in the book of Genesis, or the first foundational books. And that's obviously, for a reason, because Genesis is the book of beginnings, which we talked about all the different beginnings that occurred in the book of Genesis, the beginning of family, the beginning of human government, the beginning of sin. I mean, the list goes on. The beginning of redemption, the beginning of prophecy. It all occurred in the first mention, all occurred in the book of Genesis. So we're gonna spend the majority of the weeks in Genesis, and then we're gonna just maybe not spend as much time in each of the preceding foundational books. But now the book of Genesis, as we talked about, is divided into two sections. And we've been spending the past several weeks in section 1, which encompasses chapter 1 through chapters 11. In other words, the first 11 chapters in the book of Genesis is commonly referred to as prehistory. And in this prehistory that encompasses about 2,000 years of human history, it gives the story in these first 11 chapters 4 events that shaped the world as we know it today. 4 events that shape the world as we know it today. And those 4 events that God gives us in the first 11 chapters. And let me just, before I go on, I want to make sure I mention this, is that it would appear that in these first 11 chapters, it would appear that God, he just wants to give us sort of like an overview, sort of like the Cliff Note version of these 4 events that shape the world, because he gives us 11 chapters that encompasses 2,000 years of history. Now, in order to just put that into perspective, just consider this, that beginning at Genesis chapter 12 and 1, all the way through the conclusion of the Old Testament, all the way to the end of Malachi, encompasses another 2,000 years. And so it would seem, when you kind of like combine that and just kind of reflect on it, it would appear that God was wanting to give us this basic foundation of why the world is the way that it is before he got to the actual big story. And remember that the actual big story, which this series is going to be all about, begins in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1 with the call of Abraham and the giving of the Abrahamic covenant. But we're not there yet. But these 4 events that shape the world, remember, that's very important. Why is the world that we live in right now, why is it the way that it is? Why is there so much evil in the world? Why is the topography of the earth shaped the way that it is? Why are there so many different races and languages and cultures in the world today? and just there's so many other questions that are answered that God gives us in these first 11 chapters. And those 4 events that are given to us that shape the world that we know it today, as we know it today, are, of course, creation, the fall of man, the flood of Noah, which we've already dealt with those first 3. And today we're going to be doing the final of these 4 events, which is the Tower of Babel and the Table of Nations. The Tower of Babel and the Table of Nations. So now, first of all, before we dive into the Babel story, we just want to do some to highlight things, because we just finished last week kind of diving in and unpacking some things from the flood of Noah, and we spent the majority of our time talking about things that are not commonly taught about the Noahic flood. Because we all know about the ark and the animals and 2 by 2. That's things we learned in Sunday school that's commonly known. But I decided that I wanted to spend a lot of emphasis talking about some things that's not commonly taught. In other words, what was the pre-flood world like, which led God to destroy the earth by water in the first place? And so we talked about the sons of God. We talked about the angels, fallen angels, mating with human women, producing genetic abnormalities in the form of giants. All right, so we talked about that, and so you can go back and if you're interested, and if you're just hearing for the first time, go back and look at that, listen to that lesson, and kind of see what we're talking about. Now, let's take a look at some post-flood. Now, last week was pre-flood and the flood. Now, this week we're going to talk about post-flood, after the flood. First of all, let's look at some things that change. In other words, remember, we're talking about why the world right now is the way that it is. So this is what we're learning, and some of this, what I'm going to be sharing, is not things that necessarily will jump off the pages at you, but you kind of have to be able to. This is part of what I like to refer to, like dissecting the text, examining and taking a close look at what the text actually says, and the entire context of the text, and what it actually says and what it actually means. And so the first thing that happened, the first major post-flood change that took place, is that thermal blanket that's referred to in Genesis 1 during the creation account as the firmament is no longer there. It's gone. And how do we know? See, remember we talked about the firmament in when we're doing the creation, when we were studying the creation week, and in chapter 1 of the creation week, verse 7 and 8. Notice what it says, just as a reminder. It says, "Then God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning was the second day." So now, in the initial creation, remember we talked a lot about how the world today, the geography and the topography of the earth, is not what it was pre-flood, or even in God's original creation. It's the entire atmosphere, the entire topography of the earth, it changed. And what in God's original creation, there was a firmament. Firmament was like just to kind of put it in layman's terms, it was like a mist of water that was around the globe, and it kept the earth in one uniform basic temperature year round. And it also prevented many of the harmful radioactive rays from the sun to penetrate through the atmosphere. Remember, we also talked about, and this is just a little side nugget, and we'll just stick a pin right here real quick. We also talked about the fact that God said that this was good. And so because what the firmament did, one of the main features that it provided was that it provided a quote unquote, listen to me, it provided a greenhouse effect, which prevented many of the harmful radioactive rays from the sun to penetrate the earth. It had a lot to do with why the even after the fall, how life spans were so elongated rather, even after the fall of man. Man was living 5, 6, 7, 8, 900 years. And a lot of it had to do with the firmament that was helping to expand, helping so much of the harmful radiation, and so many other reasons. But and it kept the globe at a basic climate. And we're going to be pointing some other things that proves and demonstrate that here in a moment. But anyway, the firmament that the Bible described in Revelation, in Genesis chapter 1 in the creation account, was now gone, because when the flood happened, it wasn't just rain, because the flood narrative tells us that the waters came from above and below. And then it also changed the geography, the plate structure of the earth from a geological standpoint. All of that shifted, and all of that changed. And so that was one of the results and impact of the flood, which tells us now, why lifespans now is not anywhere near what they used to be, and so many other things that we're going to talk about. But I want to just point out one other thing also when it comes to this firmament, and because I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, because as believers, we have to rate God's word over above man's word. God said that the firmament that provided a, quote, greenhouse effect, God said it was, not only was it good, but when he was finished his creation, he said it was very good. Man now, worldly secular man, is telling us that the firmament is not good, but the firmament is bad. And so we want to always believe God rather than man. And so I just wanted to make sure I made that point and didn't forget. So let's moving on. We're talking about post-flood changes. The next post-flood change, which of course corresponded with the first one, is that it ended the universal climate. That was over at the flood. And now, how do we know this? And this is very interesting. This is where certain sciences like archaeology and geology comes into play that help us to affirm the Bible. And this is one of the things that I've always thought very interesting, and that is the fact that scientists have discovered in Antarctica, of all places, fossils of ancient rainforests and other vegetation, including early flowering plants preserved in the rock layers alongside dinosaur remains. Now let that just sink in for a minute. So why would dinosaur remains in Antarctica be right next to plant and vegetation evidence? And so that lets us know that that's just another little small piece of evidence to demonstrate that the earth as we know it today was much different then than it is now. So these discoveries indicated Antarctica once had a significantly warmer climate, supporting less vegetation akin to the temperate rainforest found in New Zealand today. So, but the thing is, I've always found interesting was the fact that man or secular scientists or secular geologists, who refuse to accept that God said what he said, and that there was a universal flood, and there was a universal basic climate, that man can't accept that. So he have to come up with different reasons to try to explain, because in their understanding, they can't really explain it. But we who believe the word of God, that the Bible is the word of God, we understand, what science has told us, along with what science is telling us now, was in the scriptures the whole time. Now, and also we mentioned also that lifespans begin to decline after the flood because their firmament was no longer there. And that's another thing that we can associate with the firmament, and that we can relate. You can just kind of like put two and two together, because after the flood, you can be, it didn't happen all at once, but gradually over generations, lifespans gradually began to decline over a number of generations. And how we know this, one of the reasons, because the account of Noah. And let's look at what the Bible tells us about Noah and his lifespan in Genesis chapter 9, verses 28 through 29. It says, and Noah lived after the flood 350 years after the flood. And then it says, and all the days of Noah were 950 years. 950 years. So now we don't have an account or instance that's recorded in scripture of anyone since Noah who lived beyond 900 years. So we can see that after Noah's generation, the lifespan gradually began to decline. And so that's an important connection to make between the loss of the firmament and the shortening over time of human lifespans. Now also another result of the post-flood or post-flood impact was that mankind no longer were vegetarians, meaning that we're vegetarians prior to the flood, but after the flood, we became meat eaters. We became carnivorous. In Genesis 9, chapter 9, verses 2 through 3, notice what it says. And God says, and this is a part, of course, of the Noahic covenant, just various aspects. And I'm not going to go through and read the entire narrative, but I am going to point out just certain aspects here and there. And notice this, it says, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moves on the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. And every moving thing that lives shall be meat for you, even as the green herbs have I given you all things. So now mankind, we're no longer from this point, which was another major change, a post-flood change, that we now become meat eaters, as opposed to simply just vegetarians prior to the flood. And then, of course, in Genesis 9 and 6, it tells us, which is another post-flood change, that capital punishment is now ordained. And this is going to lead to something else we're going to see here in a moment. But notice Genesis 9 and 6. It says, whosoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood also be shed. For in the image of God made he man. That will be Genesis 9 and 6. Now, and another post-flood change was that now, in conjunction with with capital punishment being established, human government was established. The idea or the concept of human government, and you got to keep in mind that prior to the post-flood world, there was no really such thing as a centralized government. So that's another point to keep in mind. So we see the emergence of centralized human government after the flood. So let's take a look here also as it relates to that. The beginning of human government is generally placed after the flood, specifically with the Noahic covenant of Genesis 9. And so some of the things that we've pointed out as it relates to Genesis 9, the Noahic covenant, that much of which led to or helped to constitute the formation of what we refer to as human government. Now, in this passage, God grants humanity the authority to punish those who shed human blood. Now, this, as I tried to allude to earlier, establishes the basis for a legal system of government. So, in other words, the idea that humanity is granted the authority to provide or to issue capital punishment to those who shed human blood, that means the establishment of some type of legal system had to have been formulated. And we can see that this happened after the flood. And it's interesting because we're right now we're just speaking, biblically right now, but there are other cultures around, the other post-flood cultures like the Akkadians and the Babylonians and so forth, that after this time they began to formulate their own separate rules and legal governments, and And that's a whole separate study that I find interesting, that you can maybe look into it. Now, this further developed with the account of Nimrod, in which we're going to talk about Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, where the first organized effort of self-government turns into a rebellion against God. And so, we're going to talk about Nimrod here in a little bit. But then and the role he played, because he played a significant role, but we're going to talk about it. The Rainbow Covenant. What is the Rainbow Covenant? The Rainbow Covenant, found in Genesis chapter 9, and we won't read the whole narrative, but it's verses 8 through 17, is God's promise to Noah and all living creatures after the great flood. And we symbolized it by this rainbow. The rainbow signified God's commitment never to destroy the world with the flood again. Now, the rainbow serves not only as a visual reminder of this covenant for humanity, but also for God himself. And so that's what's an important thing to keep in mind. So these are some of the post-flood changes. Now, with all of that background and there got out of the way, let's take a look at the Tower of Babel story and the Table of Nations. The Table of Nations. And the story is found in Genesis chapters 10 through 11. So now, the rebellion at Babel marks the fourth time thus far in the book of Genesis. Remember, the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis tells us how the world got to the way that it is. And so we can see that in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, there are 4 rebellions of mankind in one form or another against God. And this, the flood and the Babel account were 2 of them. So let's just take a look at what these 4 real quickly. And this is kind of summarize what happens, and this is kind of basically could serve as a summary of the first 11 chapters also. Now, in Genesis 3, he judged the sin of Adam and Eve. And I want to go back and just reiterate something or correct something. These four events that we're going to talk about are 4 times in which God is seen as judge, in which he judged humanity because of their rebellion. So that's a very important note to consider. Now, he judged Adam and Eve. In Genesis 4, he judged Cain for the murder of his brother. And then, of course, in Genesis 7, he judged the corruption of the whole world with the flood. And now we're going to be taking a look in Genesis 11, where he judges the rebellious unity or the rebellion at the Tower of Babel. Now, let's take a look at the Tower of Babel narrative. The narrative itself is given in Genesis 11, chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. Now, just as a background, this is important to keep in mind, because some people get confused by this, but it's really kind of simple. But that is that the chapters 10 and 11 is inversed, in the scriptures. In other words, the events are told after the other events. So let's look at what we mean. The Tower of Babel account told in Genesis 11 is a flashback to the point in Genesis 10 when the languages were confused. Now, what are we talking about? A flashback. In Genesis 10, it tells us the story of the Table of Nations and all the different languages and how they were dispersed throughout all of the earth. That's what Genesis 10, that's what that narrative is primarily all about. But then we jump into chapter 11. Genesis 11 describes just how the different languages and cultures and civilizations originated. I mean post-flood civilization, how they originated in the first place. And so again, the story is kind of given in reverse order. So the story in Genesis 10 tells us, the nations had already dispersed, and the languages had already been confused, and civilized cities were already being built. And then in Genesis 11, it tells us, okay, how did all this come to be in the first place? So that's, if anybody have ever been confused by that, it's just the narrative is just given to us in reverse order. So now the Tower of Babel dispersion, which is depicted in Genesis 11:1-9, was a post-flood rebellion against God by Noah's descendants. Now, in the period following the flood, God gave Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the monumental task of repopulating the earth. They were told to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. In other words, that was the same command that God gave to Adam in Genesis prior to the fall. And so that I just found that kind of interesting. Now, and remember we said that the events took place in reverse order. So the table of nations is given to us in chapter 10. And in other words, it was the chapter 10 references literally from a chronological standpoint occurred after chapter 11, but the Holy Spirit gave us chapter 10 first. So what is the table of nations? Genesis 10, commonly known as the Table of Nations, is a genealogy of Noah's sons and their descendants after the flood. Now, it is a list of patriarchal founders of 70 nations, which descended from Noah through his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So in other words, there were 70 post-flood nations that was formed, that are listed in Genesis chapter 10, and which was referred to as the Table of 70 Nations, that were descendants from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It shows how the descendants spread out into many lands after the flood. That's just kind of a thumbnail explanation of what the Table of Nations, what that term means. Now, just kind of a little bit more background. It says 26 of the 70 descendants of Shem, in other words, of the 70 nations, I meant to say 26 of those 70 nations they descended from Shem. Then 30 descended from Ham, and 14 descended from Japheth. All right, so that giving us 70 in total. Now, interestingly, Genesis chapter 10 and verse 32 gives us a really kind of a succinct summary of the entire Table of Nations narrative. And you can look at Genesis 10 and 32 and just kind of get a summary, just kind of basic overview. And notice what it says. It says, these are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies by their nations. And out of these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. So basically, to answer the question as to why there are so many races and cultures and divisions and civilizations on the earth, then the Genesis Table of Nations narrative kind of answers that question, and which we're going to even look at it even a little bit more detail here in just a little bit. Now, here's a map. If you would take a look and just kind of examine this map, kind of it kind of gives us kind of a big picture overview of the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the nation and the 70 nations overall that came out of them in that Table of Nations. And you can see, how they were divided, or Ham, Shem, and Japheth, where their territories, where their descendants and their territories were clearly identified in Genesis chapter 10. And you can clearly see that there's this delineation, and of course, the most important one, which we're going to talk about later, is going to be Shem, because it's going to be through the line of Shem that Abraham is going to be born, and then it's through the line of Abraham that the Messiah is going to be birthed. And so Shem, of the three sons of Noah, is, a lot of theologians would say that, Shem was obviously the most significant of the three sons, because it's going to be through his lineage that his fulfillment of Genesis 3:15 is going to take place, where his fulfillment, of course, with the Abrahamic covenant that says that in all the world through Abraham, all the nations of the world shall be blessed. And it's so through Shem that Jesus was born. And so Shem as we're going to see going forward, is going to be a major, and his descendants rather, is going to be major to the big picture narrative going forward. Now, the Babel, Babel narrative, and why was the division? Why did everything take place? So let's just run through this real quick. It said there was at the time, and of course this entire narrative is given to us in 9 verses in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, and everything was one language, one place, defying God's command to subdue and to fill the whole earth. Now keep that in mind. It was God's will for the whole entire earth to be filled with humanity. They decided instead to build a tower. These towers were called ziggurats to reach the heavens. And a ziggurat is a type of massive step temple structure that was built by ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. And of course, at the bottom here, you can see the one on the left is the one on the right is actually an artist drawing, and the one on the left is an actual archaeological find that you can look up that actually exists of example of what a ziggurat. Of course, this would not have been the one at the tower, but this is kind of like the foundation or the base of what it probably would have looked like, or something similar to the actual one in Genesis 10 and 11. Now, at the Tower of Babel, when the different languages came into existence, groups that spoke one language obviously moved away with others who spoke the same language, and so that kind of helped to spread different people groups and different language groups, because everybody understood. Obviously you're going to kind of gravitate to those who you understand, because it would have been very, very amazing thing to see. To see that one moment everybody is speaking the same language and understanding one another, and then a moment later you're talking to somebody and it's like blah, 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 blah. And you're gonna be like, what? And so that you can imagine the confusion that must have taken place. And so, but once everybody kind of got together, and the individuals who understood one another, they kind of gravitated to each other, and then they went and established their own various civilizations over generations around the world. Now, in doing so, and this is an important point, I want to just let me take a moment right here, because it's in doing so, the gene pool for a specific group shrank dramatically over time, as separate groups no longer had the entire human population to mix with. In other words, we can think of in terms of prior to this, you had any and everybody, as far as male and female, which you could have mated with, and you because the gene pool would have been similar, or very, very, very similar. But once the dispersion took place, now you didn't have the ability to necessarily mingle or have or bear children with people from other gene pools, and so that you had the gene pool, to put a long story short, became isolated. And so that explains, for an example, why different cultures, civilizations, you can see that they may be very tall or very short, or the skin pigmentation may be black or tan or Caucasian, or whatever the case. These various gene pools. And of course, this took place over multiple generations, because when you had isolated sets of genes that commingled with each other over time, what happened is that you would get similar genetic results from the offspring, and then that offspring would intermarry with similar, with the similar genetic profile, and it just perpetuated over multiple generations, to the point where we're all today, where different people groups, you'll find certain places where it's common to have blonde hair, for an example. And there are all kind of examples that where you have some similar genetic profiles in various different people groups around the world, but it all can be traced back to this incident here at the Tower of Babel and the Table of Nations. So now, let's just begin, and we're going to unpack the story. All of that I spent, like a half an hour just kind of giving a little bit of background of how the story came to be. So now we're going to run through real quickly. We're going to run through the biblical narrative, and we're going to look at Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. And remember, the dispersion has already taken place. Now we're getting a review as to why the events took place, why the dispersion took place in the first place. Now, in verse 1, it says, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And I want you to keep in mind one point. I want you to keep in mind this narrative where it says the land of Shinar. And I want you to keep in mind the wording and the sequence of events, because in a little bit, I'm going to point out this exact same narrative from another source, and it's going to demonstrate the validity of the scriptural source. Or what the Bible tells us. So it's going to affirm the Bible, and it's going to it's going to be another source, but it's going to confirm the Bible basically almost verbatim. So keep that in mind as we proceed. Now, then they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had bricks for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower. And I want to stick a pin right there and notice that when we speak about the narrative or this Tower of Babel narrative, the majority of people just think about the tower. So the only thing that you hear about in this entire narrative, going all the way back to Sunday school days, you hear about the tower. But it wasn't just the tower. They built a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the earth. So in other words, this is a blatant rebellion. This is a blatant disrespect to what God had said, just like in the Garden of Eden. So God has said to replenish, to be fruitful and multiply, and be scattered and replenish the entire earth. They decided that they want to do the exact opposite of what God had said, and they wanted to congregate, and they wanted to establish a civilization in one place, as opposed to doing what God said and scatter about the whole earth. So that was like what we talked about earlier, the basis for the fourth human rebellion, and basically the impetus for God coming down and scattering them abroad and confusing the languages and so forth. Now, verse 5, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. Notice the Lord didn't just come down to see the tower, but he came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of man had built. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they began to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. And right there, I just want to stick a pin right there just for a minute, because there's so much that to unpack with that. And I could spend the rest of our time today just on that, because notice what it says is that now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. That would seem to be an indication of the intellectual aspect of humanity at the time. In other words, he said that nothing they decide to do, nothing that they can think of, that will they not be able to do. And so in other words, it would appear that even the humanity at this particular time had a level of knowledge and understanding and intellect that would have allowed them to do things that that God did not want them to do. So we talked a little bit about that in the pre-flood instance. And we can see that happening again, because apparently a lot of that knowledge, and this is what a lot of scholars kind of wrestle with, but they believe that a lot of that knowledge that was gained through the Nephilims. And again, I'm not going to go back and tell that story. Go back and listen to last week's lesson. But a lot of that, it was referred to as forbidden knowledge, was still not lost after the flood. And so a lot of that knowledge was still available, which to the point where it would have been nothing intellectually that humanity at this particular time, with the materials that they had at their disposal, that they could not have done. Now, he says, "Come, let us," and notice the word "us," and we're going to talk about that going forward. Let us go down and there confuse their languages, that they may not understand one another's speech. Verse 8 says, "So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city." And finally, in verse 9, "Therefore the name of the city is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth." And of course, that city Babel later on became Babylon, and which is going to place another major role in human history, and also with the nation of Israel. But that's for down the road. Now, remember we mentioned Nimrod. So let's talk a little bit about Nimrod, who is believed to be the leader and the primary leader and instigator of all of this, of this rebellion. And so let's just take a little bit of an examination of Nimrod. And I'm a little bit behind, so I want to just kind of move fast through this. And now in the Bible, Nimrod is depicted as a powerful figure who reigned in the land of Shinar, which is now Lower Mesopotamia. Okay. Now, he is described in the scriptures. Now, keep this in mind. He is described in the scriptures, in the Bible, in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, as a mighty hunter before the Lord, and is associated with the founding of several cities, including Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Nineveh. Very important to keep in mind about this individual Nimrod. Now, while the Bible portrays him as a strong hunter, some traditions, particularly in Jewish writings, view him as the rebellious figure who opposed God, most notably in the construction of the Tower of Babel. Now, let's look at some information about Nimrod. While the Bible mentions Nimrod as a powerful king and a hunter in the land of Shinar, where the Tower of Babel was built, it doesn't explicitly state he was the one who commissioned the construction of the city and the tower. It does not. The Bible does not say that directly. So how did Nimrod traditionally down through history be equated with the one who initiated or was the instigator at the Tower of Babel, and who built the tower and the city? So now, many non-biblical traditions, including Jewish, and remember we talked last week, and I don't want to go back into a lot of detail, but we talked last week about non-canonical books that, and some people they turn their nose up or they frown when you talk about books that are not actually in the Bible. But first of all, you have non-canonical books that even though they're not in the Bible, biblical authors and writers thought enough about the works that they quoted directly or referenced them directly in their particular writings. And then of course you have Josephus, who was a Jewish author who affirms much of what in fact all of what the Bible tells us. Josephus even records he mentions Christ and the crucifixion, and kind of gives us a background and overview of that entire event, even though obviously the book of Josephus, or the Antiquities of the Jews, which is his writings are called, of course, that's not considered canonical scripture. But then of course there's the book called the Book of Jasher, and the Book of Jasher explicitly identifies Nimrod as the leader behind the Tower of Babel project. Now, let me just reference here, just talk a little bit about the Book of Jasher. The Book of Jasher is kind of similar to what we talked about last week, when we talked about the book of Enoch. We mentioned last week that the book of Enoch gives us a big picture, the wider perspective of what happened pre-flood, with the Nephilim and with the fallen angels. The book of Enoch gave us a blow-by-blow, in-depth account of what actually happened, whereas the Genesis 6 narrative just gives us a few verses, just kind of an overview of what happened. The similar with the book of Jasher. The book of Jasher gives a broad, detailed, and explanation of what happened at the Tower of Babel that the Bible just gives us. Remember, the entire narrative in Genesis chapter 11 gave us basically 9 verses. We just had 9 verses, whereas the book of Jasher goes into much, much, much greater detail and quotes some of the exact same verbatim language that we see in those 9 verses in Genesis chapter 11. Now, just to give an example, the book of Jasher is referenced twice in the Old Testament. It's referenced in Joshua 10 and 13, and it's also referenced in 2 Samuel 1 and 18. These verses indicate that the book of Jasher was a historical text. Remember, we talked last week that there are books that may not be canonical, but ancient writers and the book and the Bible and biblical writers and biblical people who lived in Bible times viewed these books, Enoch, Jasher, and also books like the Book of Jubilees. They viewed these books as historical at the time of the events that these books are described. Now, the book of Jasher is also mentioned in 2 Timothy verses 3 and 8. And so that lets you know that the Christian authors had enough confidence in the historical accuracy of these non-canonical books that they reference them in their writings. So that's very important to keep in mind. I mean, if you really want to be a very, very scholarly, in-depth, more in-depth rather, student of Scripture, it's something that we don't want to dismiss some of these non-canonical books when they're especially when it comes to comparing their narrative with the actual biblical narrative. And you're going to be, once you get into that, you're going to be amazed at the similarities and at the accuracy. And it's just going to, I find it really, really amazing. The first time I started studying and taking a look at, for example, the book of Enoch, I was just blown away how much similarities there are in the biblical account and what's also in the book of Enoch, and how New Testament writers like Jude and Peter references and quotes from the book of Enoch directly. So and again, indicating just how confident they were in the historicity of some of these non-canonical books. So I'm going to just leave that there, because I could go on a tirade with that, but we're going to stop right there. But in Josephus' Antiquity of the Jews, Nimrod is depicted as a powerful and defiant figure who instigated the building of the Tower of Babel. He is portrayed as a leader who encouraged people to reject God's authority. So again, and this is of course Josephus, and many of you are familiar with Josephus, and he specifically identifies Nimrod as the instigator. Josephus goes on to explain that Nimrod's motivation was to avenge God for the flood and to establish a kingdom under his own rule. Remember, we mentioned earlier that the beginning of human government was one of the post-flood changes, and we can see this. The first instance of this was with Nimrod. Now, also we mentioned about in the book of Jasher, Nimrod is also portrayed as a powerful hunter and a king who leads the construction of the Tower of Babel. So in other words, the book of Jasher affirms that Nimrod was the primary instigator. He is depicted as a strong leader who united the people and established the kingdom. Now, here's a picture that archaeologists have discovered of Nimrod holding a full-grown lion in one arm. And it is believed because of this, and of course we don't know for sure. I don't know if there's any specific evidence, but based on this statue that was discovered, some theologians, they theorize that Nimrod may have been a descendant of the Nephilim, or maybe would have had Nephilim DNA. So we don't have any way of affirming that, but based on this statue, that's just kind of a little nugget there I thought I would throw in, because that is a wide held belief by some very prominent scholars. Now, the Book of Jubilees and the Tower of Babel. I just want to tell this. This is what I think is so interesting, and another reason why it's the history of some of these non-canonical books can be so helpful in understanding the big picture of the biblical narrative. It's not you're not changing the biblical narrative. What you're doing is you're getting an expanded understanding of what God has given to us in His Word. Now, notice this. He gives in the Book of Jubilees, they give us a detailed and description about what happened at the Tower of Babel, and including details about the tower's height and how the violent destruction that took place. Now let's just take a look at this, and I'm not going to just read this entire, but if you can maybe Google Jubilee, the Book of Jubilees, chapter 10 and 19, and it gives us the size of the Tower of Babel before it was destroyed. And notice this language too, by the way, because remember I told you when we were quoting Genesis chapter 11 verses 1 through 9, I wanted to point out the specific wording. So for they departed from the land of Ararat eastward to Shinar, for in his days they built the city and the tower. So and he there was talking about Nimrod in that narrative. So now, and he said, go, let us ascend into heaven. That's Jubilees 10 and 21. And they built it, and 40 and 3 years were they building it. So this construction took place. This is another added piece of detail that we get in the non-canonical Book of Jubilees, that it was it took 40 and 3 years that they were actually working on. So this didn't just happen. Remember, they were also building a city as well. So now moving at the bottom, if you just want to just take a look, so I won't read all this narrative, but and putting into it, because it gives us the size, of course, of ancient measurements. But those ancient measurements has been interpreted to be 8,150 feet, or to put it more specifically, is 1.5 miles tall, and that's how high they were able to get it prior to the conclusion or prior to its destruction. And to put that in perspective, notice this artist rendering here of some of the tallest buildings that's currently on Earth. The Sears Tower, the One World Trade Center, and notice how tall the Tower of Babel in comparison was in relation to these other towers. So just kind of reflect on that, and and kind of give you an idea of the ingenuity of humanity. Remember the Lord said that nothing will be nothing will be not be able to be done with them. Okay, because notice the ingenuity that mankind had, because this structure was 1.5 miles high. And so before God finally came down and put an end to it. So that I just thought that was very interesting. And it also affirms, one of the things I really love about this particular narrative is that it affirms the biblical narrative. It affirms the fact that God's word is true, and the Bible is the actual word of God, and the history that's recorded in the word of God is what we can count on and we can depend on as being accurate and true. Now, moving forward, I want to get this in real quick, and I want to talk a little bit about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Now, this is going to be an important component, because this is another aspect of the story of the Table of Nations story that's been in the Bible, that's been in Genesis, but in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, that's been a part of the narrative the entire time, but is one of those other nuggets, you could say, that's not commonly taught in churches or in Sunday school, for an example, and even in a lot of seminaries. And as a matter of fact, this particular aspect. So what do we mean, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview? What exactly is that? So let's take a look. The Deuteronomy 32 worldview, the rebellion against God that took place at Babel, must be understood in light of Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 7 through 9. Now, let's take a look at what it says in verses 7 through 9. And remember this. Now, this is Deuteronomy, and keep in mind that the book of Deuteronomy it remains the second law. Deuteronomy means second. And it means that this was the second generation that came out of Egypt, who had, at the conclusion of the 40-year wanderings, about to go cross over the Jordan River to conquer the promised land. And the final instructions, or the final message by Moses that was given to this generation prior to them going over to begin their conquest of the promised land. So now notice what Moses says. He says, remember the days of old. Keep that in mind. Consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, he will show thee thy elders, and they will tell thee. Notice in verse 8, when the Most High divided the nations. Now, when did that take place? When did the Most High divide the nations? Of course, obviously, that was at the Tower of Babel. Now, notice what it goes on to say. In their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Now, just stick a pin right there and just keep that in mind. And I'm going to repeat that ending, because we're going to see a little bit of a controversial nuance here. And it's going to help us it's going to give us a little bit of a biblical interpretation little lesson here also as well. Now it says, according that he set the bounds, he being God, of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. So now let's go on. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. Now, just let that soak in right there as we move forward. Now, and now let's look at another version. This is the English Standard Version. This is because what we just read was the King James. And notice what the ESV says. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance. This was after the dispersion. Okay, after the 70 nations, the 70 nations dispersion. When he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. Now, notice we have a controversy here, because we have a version that says the number of the children of Israel, but this says something completely different. It says the number of or this interpretation says the number of the sons of God. So, we have a problem here. Houston, we have a problem. So is it the sons of God or the sons of Israel? Which is it? Which is the correct interpretation? Now, I want to talk a little bit about, because this is where we get some nuance, what we call textual variants. And basically, in short, and you have three different textual variants that describe, is it the sons of God or the sons of Israel? And the answer, whichever one was the accurate or the rightly divided answer, is going to be completely changed what the text is actually telling us. So in short, a textual variant refers to differences in wording found across multiple copies of a text, particularly noticeable in ancient manuscripts. Just to make a long story short, we don't have any actual what in theological terms is referred to as autographical copies. In other words, we don't have any original autographed copies of the original writers. So we don't have the original book of Isaiah penned by Isaiah. We have copies who were then transcribed into other copies, into various languages, and ones with different nuances depending upon who the scribe was. And so we have centuries of copies on top of copies, on top of languages on top of language. And that's what we mean by textual variant. So you're going to have variants or various different wordings or interpretations or different usages of languages as over the centuries in terms of copying biblical text. So the term textual variants, that's in a nutshell. It's more in depth than that, but in a nutshell, that's what it means. Now, um, first of all, you have what was referred to as the Masoretic text, and it gives it interprets that Deuteronomy 32 and 8 as the sons of Israel. Now, who are the Masoretic text, by the way, which was most of the English translations that we have, and particularly the King James, the Masoretic text was used in order to make the copies. Now, the Hebrew text of the Old Testament is called the Masoretic text. The Masoretes were rabbis who made it their special work to correct what they perceived as faults that had crept in over the centuries in the Old Testament text, especially during the Babylonian captivity. They believed to have been completed in about the 10th century AD. So that would have been what, 1,000, about 1,000 years. Yeah, that would have been about 1,000 years after the birth of Christ, or somewhere in there. So, and that's what referred to. There was a group of rabbis known as the Masoretes, and where we get the term the Masoretic text, and they interpreted Deuteronomy 32 and 8 as the sons of Israel. But here's the thing. Notice this: the Dead Sea Scrolls has interpretation of the same exact text, where the usage with the term sons of God is is reading the Hebrew B'nai Elohim. B'nai Elohim. And keep this in mind. Remember when we talked about the sons of God in the Genesis 6 narrative, and when the reference to sons of God was made, it was this exact same term, B'nai Elohim. So that's very important to keep in mind as we go forward. Then the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, also has B'nai Elohim, or the sons of God. So most modern theologians hold to the fact, because also at the time when the dispersion took place, which is another clue that there was no children of Israel. It was no Abraham. There was no children of Israel at that particular time. And so to return that, or to reference that as the sons of Israel, it wouldn't seem to fit into the narrative. But on the other hand, when we look at the term separated according to the sons of God, that seems to fit into the narrative much more seamlessly. And so this is the reason why a lot of scholars they believe and hold to the idea that the Deuteronomy 32 and 8 is referring to, they were separated according to the sons of God, or B'nai Elohim. Now let's go a little bit further. Now the sons of God interpretation. If interpreted as the sons of God, if that interpretation is correct, then the verse suggests that God assigned the nations to different divine beings or angelic beings, or other spiritual entities who would be responsible for the governance of these these civilizations. Keep that in mind. That's a very, very powerful point that it gets missed when it comes to talking about the table of nations and the dispersion at the Tower of Babel. So in other words, God assigned angelic entities over each of these 70 nations with the responsibility of governance in the unseen realm of the success and failure of these future nations. Now, the interpretation aligns with ancient Near Eastern cosmology, where divine beings were understood to have roles in government, governing different parts of the world. And so I want to just get into this. Now, here are some examples. This is what I've been, all this time, I've been really trying to hurry up and get to this. So in Daniel 10, we see that famous account where Daniel had been praying for 21 days, and his prayer was interrupted by an angelic being that came and he began to speak with Daniel. Now notice some of the things that came out of that. In Daniel 10, the angel said, the prince of Persia or the prince of Greece are not literal. I mean, he references rather the prince of the angelic being that appeared to Daniel in chapter 10, in Daniel 10, reference the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. And they are not literal human rulers, which is obvious if you examine the text. but rather they are spiritual entities like demonic beings that are in conflict with God's kingdom and his angels in the unseen realm. So now that's important to keep in mind as part of the overall narrative. Now the passage describes in Daniel 10 celestial battle where Michael the archangel is contending against the prince of Persia and then prepares to face the prince of Greece. And now you got to keep in mind that there is no way that this could be referencing any human individual. This had to have been, when we're talking about Michael the archangel contending with the prince of Persia or the prince of Greece, these had to be the angelic or the angelic spirits or the demonic spirits that was over the nation of Greece and over the nation of Persia. And so that means that because otherwise the text wouldn't make any sense at all, because there's no way that a human being would have been able to contend. Now, these figures represent spiritual forces behind the earthly kingdoms of Persia and Greece, which is clear if you go back and read the entire narrative, which we won't take the time to do right now because my time is almost up. But the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, prophecies concerning Persia and Greece. Now, this is just a quick reading of the quick narrative, and I'm just going to go through it real quick. Suddenly a hand touched me, which made me being Daniel, which made me to tremble on my knees and on the palms of my hands. And he said to me, "O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak to you and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you." While he was speaking this word to me, I stood trembling. Then he said to me, "Do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day," remember he had been praying for 21 days, for the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came and helped me, for I had been left alone with the king of Persia. And now I have come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision refers to many days yet to come. Now, then he said, do you know why I have come to you? This is verse 20. And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I have gone forth, indeed, the prince of Greece will come. So in other words, this is kind of the narrative. This is one of the many examples in scripture that affirms the fact that we're not dealing with, these narratives are not dealing with flesh and blood individuals, but rather with spiritual forces in the unseen realm that have authority over certain nations. And of course, God gave this authority, as he assigned to various nations a spiritual entity, which apparently that some of them or many of them may not have, or they may have fallen just like the fallen angels in the post-flood narrative, which we won't go back into again. But God had said in the narrative in the in Deuteronomy 32, verse 9, he said, "But I am keeping Israel as my portion to myself." In other words, I'm assigning all the other nations, to angelic beings, but Israel, I got them. They're going to be, I'm going to take care of them. I got them. So now, but I will tell you what is noted in the scriptures of truth. No one upholds me against these except Michael, your prince. So again, this is the angelic being speaking to Daniel. And of course, you can see Michael confronting with the Persian spirit of Persia in this particular image. But the scripture tells us clearly, that Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12. And this is so important, because we really don't think about this. And we quote it. I mean, this is one of the most commonly quoted verses in scripture, but unless you really understand the impact and the study, like if you're doing studies like this and seeing the total impact and influence that these unseen entities are having on the world, you can really actually see it as opposed to just reading this verse. But the verse does say, and the verse is full of truth, It says, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. And so, in other words, we're dealing with unseen forces in the, or demonic spiritual forces in the unseen realm. Now, there's a book, and I'm almost done. I got about another minute, and I'm going to be done. There's a book that goes into great detail that I just thought I would throw up on the screen as a reference for those of you or anybody who would be interested in exploring this idea of the unseen realm in more depth. There's a book by a great Hebrew scholar. His name was Michael Heiser. Dr. Heiser was one of my favorites for a long time, but he unfortunately passed away a year ago. But his writings are just going to be there. His YouTube videos. I mean, you just Google him and you'll see. But this book, The Unseen Realm, Discovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible, is a great resource that I think that everybody who's interested in this particular topic of the unseen world, you need to have this in your library. Now, Babel and the Table of Nations summary. Let's just do a brief summary. And then we're going to be out of here. We had the Table of Nations in chapter 10, which basically told us how everything came to be. And the Babel story explains the nations came to be. And the Babel story, of course, is in Genesis 11, but in Genesis 10 tells us about the dispersion. The nations dispersed all over the earth. Each nation was allotted a specific territorial boundaries, and each nation had its own language, geography, and gods, small g, that God had assigned to them. And that's very important to keep in mind. And of course, if you track, and this is of course another study that I'm gotta catch myself because I want to dive into, but I won't take the time to dive into it. But if you examine the study of ancient civilizations and their polytheistic gods that they worship, you can definitely see some connection between this narrative and some of their polytheistic gods that they worship, but particularly like ancient Greece. I mean, it's just so blatantly obvious. And then also some of their ancient Greece, some of the pre-flood deities, the fallen angels, and what not normal human beings must have thought, because they obviously would have used them or viewed them as gods. And so that kind of gives credence to a lot of the Greek mythology, just as an example, because I often like to reference when I'm talking about this to ancient Greece, because I used to be like a ancient Greece historical nerd. And so that's another story. I can talk about it another time. But as a matter of fact, when I get to I'm going to do a study. I'm going to do like a parenthetical study later on. When we get into the captivity period of the nation of Israel, I'm going to take a pause and I'm going to do a study called the Daniel Factor, which I may tell that story about me and ancient Greek mythology. I might tell that story at that point. Now, finally, anybody who would be interested in learning more or just getting ahead of the game, or if you're just picking up on this for the first time, you want to kind of get caught up, I have a resource on my website, bruceloganministries.com. It is a PDF download study guide of this big picture of the Bible. It's a study guide. It's 135 pages, and they're going to have a lot of the same graphics and maps and diagrams that I use in this online study, and that you can buy and follow along. And it's not a hard copy. It's a PDF download. Keep that in mind. It's a PDF download. It's 135 pages, a lot of color graphics and art, and it'll be perfect for those who are teachers, who want to like create their own PowerPoints, or who want to print out handouts. If you're doing a group study, adult Sunday school class where you can print out handouts, and it's perfect for that. But again, it's a PDF download. I want to make sure I make that clear. And you go to the store. It says $14.95, and of course I just charge a nominal fee because I did put a lot of work into it. So if you will. And plus, that would help me to grow the things I'm trying to grow this channel and to grow this ministry. So it would all work kind of hand in hand. So again, now, and I'm going to close with this, is that this is the trademark. What I'm attempting to do is that I am attempting to create a community of Bereans. This is my trademark premise. I laid out a lot of stuff that I would imagine that many of you maybe have never heard before. You know, for example, like the role that Nimrod played, or the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Many of you maybe have not have heard that. Excuse me, the book of the impact of the book of Enoch, and so many things that we talked about so far in this study. And what I want to do is I want to challenge you to, and I do this on purpose. I want to challenge you to be able to not take anything that I say, that you can take everything I say with a grain of salt, but my desire is to see you search the scriptures, be like these Bereans. Notice Acts 17 and 11, which is one of my actual favorite single verses in all of the New Testament. It says, "Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness, and they examined the scriptures every day to see whether or not the things that Paul said were true or not." And you got to keep in mind that these Bereans, they were being taught by the Apostle Paul, probably the greatest teacher outside of Jesus Christ, maybe that ever walked the earth. And they were being taught by them. But in spite of that, they were hungry, and they wanted to go and see. I ain't never heard this before, so I need to go and see what Paul is telling us is actually in the scriptures. And also keep in mind this one last point, that when it says that they went and examined the scriptures every day, that at this particular time, all they had at their disposal was the Old Testament canon. There were no New Testament. There was no, at this particular point in time. It came later, but here at this moment, there was no, First and Second Corinthians. There was no Romans. There was no Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John. There was no Revelation. All they had was the Old Testament in order to reference. And so that also gives us an indication of the value and the importance in the Old Testament. And by understanding this big picture narrative that we're going through right now, it's going to help you to understand how all these various puzzle pieces fit into the big picture so much better. And so with that, I'm going to get you out of here. But before I do, I want to ask that you would please, if you can visit my website at drbruceloganministries.com or bruceloganministries.com. And you can follow me at DBL Ministries on Facebook. Follow me on Twitter. You can email me questions, comments, or concerns, and br2logan@aol.com. And please, if you wouldn't mind, to remember to click the bell and in order to be reminded and subscribe to this channel, so that when the next lesson in this series we'll get ready to go again, you will receive a notification. So God bless you, and hopefully we'll see you again next week. And so now, again, God bless you. We'll see you again next week. And next week, we're going to be going into the actual big story. God just gave us a thumbnail in the first 11 verses. I'm sorry, the first 11 chapters. God basically gave us a thumbnail of what is happening, of how the world became what it is. Next week, beginning with the Genesis chapter 12, and we're going to dive into Act 2 of the book of Genesis with the call of Abraham. And it's going to be with the call of Abraham that the real big story, with the real storyline, is going to come to start to be opened up and be revealed. And we're going to really see, we're going to be able to follow it with the Abrahamic covenant beginning next week, where the main story of the Old Testament is going to begin to unfold. So with that, God bless you, and may you have a blessed week, and we'll see you all again next week.